Hey, welcome back to the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joe Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
And today we are coming to you live for our first ever live podcast. We're here with a live studio audience in Arden, Delaware. We have an awesome group of people that were part of an experience this weekend where we're doing some teaching, some live course, and then we're doing this live podcast together. It's an experiment. Something we'd love to do more of on the road is do these live podcasts around the country, around the world, wherever you are, inviting us to come to your community. We'd love to show up and do something like that. We're actually in Arden, Delaware. We're about, it's like 30, 40 miles, I think, south of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And Philadelphia was the origination point of the United States of America. It was where the U.S. was founded and birthed in the late 1700s. And there was a gentleman that is very famous from Philadelphia. His name was Benjamin Franklin. And when he was a young man, he was 21 years old in 1727, he formed a small community of like minds around himself called Junto. It was a group of people that got together that were around his contemporaries, his age group, that talked about personal growth. They talked about new ideas. I mean, this is a time of the Enlightenment, right? This is when new ideas are on the scene around the world, and things are traveling faster than ever before. Franklin, in Philadelphia, forms this group, this intentional community of like minds, just like himself, in order to explore some of the bigger topics of the world, explore, what's going to happen in the next 100, 200, 300 years. This is way before the founding of the United States. And I think it's really an interesting thing to think about because we're here in Arden, Delaware. We're in a very unique community. And I think of Junto because we're here in Arden, which is a creative community that is formed intentionally in the last 100, 125 years around honoring people's individuality, creativity, and it's a really unique place. If you ever get a chance to come here to Arden, it's a really unique place to come. One of our profiler training students, Meighan, who's with us today. Hi, Meighan. I'm going to go ahead and unmute your mic and you can join us live.
Hi, Joel.
Meighan's here with us today, and she actually lives here in Arden. She invited us to come and be a part of this experience, doing our first live podcast here, because of the friendly environment, the friendly community, the intentional community that sprung up here. And so I want to talk to you a little bit, Meighan, before we start into more of the core content of this podcast, a little bit about the community, a little bit about what your experience is here and what your experience has been and what this is all about.
Well, I've lived here about 10 years, and it's a place where you can get really involved in all kinds of activities and in the community. There's like community dinners, there's guilds of all kinds of interests that you can get into. So like singing or contra dance or Shakespeare, gardening. There's what's called guilds, and so it's a very involved community, and you can be actually as involved or not involved as you want. But the opportunities are there, and the opportunities are also to do something like this. There's the space that allows different activities into Arden.
Sure.
How did the community of Arden, how was it created? What is its origin? How did you get to a place where you have space for guilds and creativity and such a strong community feel?
Yeah, we just drove through earlier and we were looking at the houses here. It's such an eclectic mix of people and the expressiveness in the house. I mean, there's this one house where in the yard they have mannequins and it's an artistic garden area. I mean, it's really unique. You drive around town and no house is the same as another house. Set in the woods. It's such a unique community. It's a very small, it's 160 acres, I think. I read online, right?
All right, you know more than me. 160 acres it is.
It's 160, that's technical stuff to stand out to me. I don't know. Yeah. But 160 acres. But what's it like? I mean, so how did it found and what's it like living here? Let's start with how did it get founded?
Okay, so some time ago, I guess, over 100 years ago, the Philadelphians started coming down here for summer, like a summer break, vacations, et cetera, like that. And so it kind of organically started, and as well as there was some involvement with some ideologies around what a community is about, and that included an architect and a sculptor and crafts theory and some so sort of around people being individualistic and exploring their interests.
Yeah. one of the most important aspects of it, of course, is what it feels like to live in a community like this. Like, what is the result? Obviously, not everybody's going to get along with each other all the time, but in a community like this, it almost feels a little utopian. So what does it feel like to you to live in a community that has so much creativity and so much, you mentioned before that there are different guilds here. We talked about all the different theaters that are propped up and set up. What does it feel like to be a part of this community?
I think it's around feeling really supported, and your interests and skills and talents are wanted by the community to be able to do all these interesting activities that range, as you said, from theater to singing to dancing. There's a Shakespeare group. There's just a huge number of things that you can get involved with. The feeling is one of acceptance, and there's a sense of excitement also, about connecting with other people and having a community that's there for you.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the words we talked about before in being in communities that are so intentional and give so much space to people is that you feel very supported. And so one of the things that I think is really magical about Arden that I've seen so far is that it feels like even if not everybody would get along with everybody else, there's still a general sense of acceptance and support. And I've noticed things like, community gardens and, just things that feel very volunteer oriented. It doesn't feel like people are doing this for any specific profit or any specific end game. It just feels like they're supporting each other for their own creativity and also doing a lot of volunteering to support each other and to entertain each other and to feel expressive and to create local gardens and so many different flavors of expressiveness, and everybody's cool with it.
Yeah, there's a huge amount of volunteering going on, and people really enjoy what they're doing, and they're doing it from a place of passion, and that's what really makes it work. Every year we put on a fair over Labor Day, the Saturday of Labor Day, and it's very well attended, and it's just an amazing amount of things you can do in a very small space here.
So we were just out in Portland, Oregon, visiting some family that, Antonia's got some family out there we were visiting. And Portland is a really unique city at this time of this recording. I'm sure it's going to be really cool for a long period of time. It's a community that you're talking about very similar to what you're saying, where it feels like the individual's honored. Like when you're in the city of Portland, Oregon, you feel like, and maybe to its own detriment in some ways, that the individual's honored above the collective, but yet there's a collective element of honoring the individual. And everybody's very expressive. It feels very open and free. What I really love about Arden is it has that feel, but what's interesting about it, and this is going to tie into what we're going to talk about today on the podcast, it was not just a community that is supportive. It's not just a place that you've chosen to live because it emerged in a cool way and it's very focused on honoring the creative expression of an individual. It was intentionally set up that way. In other words, it didn't just happen. Some people said, let's get together and let's create a community that's really unique, different, and let's do some experimentation. I read some stuff online about how there's 160 acres, right? And the ground underneath the entire community, everyone collectively owns. I don't exactly know how this works, but you basically lease the land space underneath your house. You own your house, but collectively the community is owned by all the people that live there. And there's shared resource, and it's a very unique economic model of how they set things up. And I love the intention that, I think it was around 1900, when this was put together, of this community. I think it's really interesting. And today we want to talk about, and the reason why we're interviewing and talking to you about being here in Arden, one of the reasons we're here is to look at the community, be here a part of the community, and then talk about what does it look like to create intentional communities in our lives as people that are interested in growth and development and want to connect with others.
Yeah.
And we want to explore that today on today's podcast.
Yeah, totally. So thank you so much, Meighan, for sharing information about Arden.
Sure.
So an intentional community is generally considered a community that was put together with a starting point, it just didn't organically necessarily spring up based on its proximity to resource or to a river or whatever. It's like there was a community that came together based on shared ideals or because they're like minds. And we see that in communes. But we also see it when I look at Arden, I can't help but compare and contrast it to an intentional community like Celebration, Florida. I don't know if you've ever been to Celebration, but Celebration is effectively the corporation of Disney, right? Like Disney World. decided to make what appears to be an almost paradisaic small town. And the thing is just, I mean, everybody's houses are just perfect and the yards are perfectly manicured and they have all of the, you know, like the perfect national and international chains there. Like you've got your Starbucks and you've got like other chains like that. And it's meant to feel almost unreal in how perfect it is.
White picket fences, like all the, you know, grass has to be mowed a certain way and all this.
Exactly. And I could see people like really loving that community. I mean, it looks charming. It looks like it comes out of a cartoon. And then when you look at Arden, Arden's more like the Shire, right? It looks like you're in Hobbiton or something. And everybody, I mean, nobody cares if you mow your grass. And people are putting mannequins in their yards in, you know, creative ways. And it just has this really like organic, natural feel. And so,
but it wasn't just organic. I mean, someone set intention to build it.
Right. They're both intentional communities. Exactly. They both had the same starting place, which is we would like something cool to be here. We would like something cool to exist. So we're going to put some intention behind it. But the result is very different. And of course, obviously, it's going to cater to different styles. But what's so great about Arden is that while it was intentional, it feels organic because it was a matter of like-minded people coming together. It's a matter of people who are very expressive wanting to come together, whereas Celebration is people who want perfectly manicured yards coming together, right? Like they want that cartoon style. And both are perfectly fine, but the thing that I think is so interesting is how you can create an entire town or sub-town from intention, from like-mindedness. And I think we do that in the digital age. We do this all the time with digital communities. Online communities, we have intentional communities that come together through like-minded ideals or like-minded interests. What's interesting about this is that while it's an intentional community in the sense that people come together based on their shared interests or values, I don't think the word intentional is really getting the bang for the buck that it can. Everything we do, like here at Personality Hacker, we always admonish people to be as thoughtful as possible when they do anything. Put as much intention behind something as possible. And my observation has been that when it comes to communities, like our physical location, there tends to be very little intention behind that. We like a house, and so we purchase that house, and it happens to be in a neighborhood filled with people that we don't really necessarily know our neighbors, and we just kind of have to put up with them and whatever their idiosyncrasies are, and we might have absolutely nothing in common with them. And so most of the time, our community, like the physical community we're in, we feel is sort of a mixed bag. Like we just have to take what we get when it comes to our physical community. And we might move there based on proximity to a particular school we want our kids in, or we might move there because it's close to our job or whatever it is. But we don't really feel like we have much choice in that community. And so we do that online too. We take this limited belief of how much we can make intention around community. We bring that into the online space to go, okay, well, I'm going to create this maybe Facebook group, or I'm going to create this forum, or maybe this blog or whatever. And whoever shows up, and I'll make it on a subject, and they'll be like-minded people, but I can't really necessarily like determine what kind of intention I want around that. And what's so great and magical about Arden is that it shows that if you put the right intention behind something, you can actually craft something very cool. And the reason why it's so important to have intention behind the communities you create is there's an axiom or a saying that says that you are the median of the 5 people you hang around with.
Yeah.
So the people, if you want to know who you are, write down the 5 people you spend the most hours with, and you're somewhere in between all 5 of them. So clearly the people around us have an extraordinary influence on how we're going to show up, what kind of people we're going to be. And we can't discount how much our communities influence us in a very similar way. We are energetically surrounded by our community. So even if we're not hanging out with anybody there, the vibration, which might sound a little woo-woo, but basically sort of like the temperature of the community is absolutely going to impact us. So the more intention we set behind our community, the more intention we set around where we're spending our time and the kind of people we're spending our time with. And if we want to escape our physical community, going online and spending time digitally with other people or in a virtual space, the intention we set there is very important because we are going to become a product of these people we're spending all of our time with. We're going to become a product of the energy we surround ourselves with.
If we back up a little bit and we talk about community like you're talking about with a physical place, like where we are here in Arden, or what I talked about at the very beginning of the podcast with Benjamin Franklin creating Junto in Philadelphia, it used to be that you had to be in a physical proximity to have community. I mean, this idea you mentioned online is a pretty new concept in the last 30 years of having any kind of quote unquote online community. Anytime we hung out with people of like minds, we had to physically get into their presence. And so, before the internet, maybe conferences or somewhere you would go. You'd go to a conference on a certain topic. I mean, Antonia and I met at a conference learning neuro-linguistic programming. We met at an NLP conference. That's how we connected. We found a community of like minds, and we happened to come to the same place, and we met each other there. And it was driven by online. Like, we found out about it online, but it could have been before the internet. It could have been a temporary experience that we were at and got to meet other people. What I love about what you said about online is it's opening up the world into a much different way. I remember reading recently about someone who was talking about dating. They were talking about how most people throughout the history of the world basically ended up mating or marrying with someone that was close proximity to them. So it wasn't so much about finding someone that had like interests, like values. It was about who is mateable age in my range here that I can marry or get together with and have children with and set up a family with. And usually that was within if you're lucky, a 30-mile radius, but usually it was within like a 10-mile radius of like the town you're in or maybe the next town over was it for like most of human history. That's how we got together with other people. And all of a sudden this internet thing comes online. Now we've had like other technologies up till now, but internet has really changed the game. People can now begin to look for other people of like mind to get together in a relationship with, and they don't have to just take what is available in their immediate backyard, which changes everything. So I heard this thing about somebody talking about, they're like, I think that couples will probably get together and stay together longer now that we have the internet because of online dating, weirdly enough, even though there's always been a stigma in the past about that. But we're connecting on like mind value things rather than just proximity things as we go forward. And I think the same is going to happen for all sorts of connection with people. And you can see this happening already with you guys here that are in the audience. I mean, you're here because you heard about this, and we're forming this temporary experience together, and we're forming this little mini community for a few hours. And then we're going to disperse, and we'll maybe stay connected on Facebook and on the internet, but we get this energetic experience here in real time with each other. So I think this idea of a physical proximity, and I'd like to talk a little more about this, and then the online experience and how can those two worlds merge with the idea that we're going through the world seeking out the people that we want to connect with.
There is a sense that we're on the receiving end of a lot of what we experience in life, and that includes community. Like where I move, I just have to take whoever my neighbors are or whatever town I end up living in, which may or may not have been choice, or we feel like it may or may not have been choice. It's always choice. But we might feel like we didn't have any choice in where we live. And one of the things that I think is so crucial is for us to recognize and understand just how much power and influence that we have as people when we want to start crafting a very intentional community. You can find like-minded people no matter where you go. But one of the things you have to do is you have to be willing to put yourself out there and expose yourself. Expose who you are, expose your vulnerabilities, expose what your like-minded elements are in order to attract like minds. Like nobody's going to know who you are or what you're about until you show up in that way. And oftentimes I think we just sort of wait for it to happen. We wait for somebody to show up, maybe get in our orbit, and we go, "Oh, you're really cool and I'll hang out with you." But something like Arden, which apparently the heavens just opened up because there's like a major thunderstorm happening outside. And I noticed that because everybody's looking outside and go, ooh. And that's what happens in a live podcast. I'm like, what's going on behind me? Oh, it's just rain. So what's so interesting about a community like Arden is that people had to get the ball rolling. Like somebody had to be the weirdo to put the mannequins in the yard. Like somebody had to be the first person to do that. Somebody had to be the person who decided that they wanted to volunteer their time to like throw together a community theater or to start a guild. And what's cool about Arden is that at this point, it attracts people from outside the community to come in. I mean, Meighan was talking about, before we started the podcast, she was talking about how they have these dinners, these community dinners once a week. And people from outside the community will come to the community dinner because it's just so cool. So Arden has gotten the ball rolling by creating these community dinners that are now attracting like minds from outside the community. So there's a sense of proactivity there. There's a sense of making something available and making it public that this thing is available that will attract the people that you want, the element that you want into your community. And then you create your community. I mean, it could be small. Your community could be 3 people. It could be a tiny little burgeoning embryo of a community of like-minded people that will eventually get bigger and bigger. And we've talked about the importance of tribes before. Creating a tribe, a feeling of unconditional acceptance, a feeling like you have this family that you got to choose as opposed to the family you didn't get to choose, which could also be extremely important to you as well. They could be your tribe. They could be part of your community. But some of us don't have that luxury anymore. Like, we might not have the greatest relationship with our family, maybe not even by our own choice. And so our tribe becomes the family we get to choose. And the tribe can turn into an entire community, which means that not only do you have these people you're super tight with and are tight with each other, and you create these little triads of tightness and this profound love experience you have with each other, but then you can also extend it out to people who you might not have picked to be a part of your tribe, but can be part of your community, can make up for some of your deficiencies maybe, or suggest things you would have never considered before. I'm sure here in Arden, the people who are super into the Shakespearean theater may or may not have been the people who suggested these community gardens. And the people who suggest the community gardens may or may not be the kind of people that would suggest, opening space for different spiritual practices here or whatever. So a community now creates this tribe experience into sort of a larger context and makes it so that you make more things available to attract more people in a bigger orbit. And this concept of community, I believe, is so important. I think we massively undervalue community. I think we've gotten to a place where we have sterilized our concept of community to a point where we think that our community is just, like we've got a neighborhood and we've got a church over there and a park over there and a school over there, and that's community, which I believe doesn't nourish a very ancient part of us that remembers living in intimacy with 150 people, where we watched each other's kids on like an hourly level, where we all got together surrounding the same kills. Like, that was a very long time we spent there. And then all of a sudden we went into a more industrial, more of an institutionalized way of living. And we lost some of that. We lost some of that community, that tribal feel. And so we tried to recreate these communities by creating the institutions that will require us to meet with each other, but we forget how important it is to become a community of people who have each other's back, who are truly supportive of each other no matter what. There's an ancient part of us that wants that community love, that feeling like we have each other's back no matter what. And I think we've lost something in translation.
Yeah, as you talk about this, I remember, so if you've heard the Graves model podcast, what I'm going to reference is a model that we've talked about. Just go to personalityhacker.com and type in the search term Graves model. We have a whole podcast, an article on it, some information on it. And as you're talking, I'm almost thinking about community in terms of how it expresses itself based on a person's level of development. And I think it's different for different people. You were talking about this idea that we've lost that tribal, we all live in like a nomadic tent community maybe 100,000 years ago, and we travel together, and 150 of us kill a kill, and we eat it together, and there's like, it's a tribal type community focus. We get into our modern world where you talked about it being institutionalized. It's like we have this development. I think the Graves model is really informative here. We have this institutionalization. Well, okay, I'm going to go, 100 years ago church was a huge part of people's community experience. They would join a church or a spiritual practice, and they would go once a week to have their quote unquote community, and maybe a potluck dinner or like another get together midweek, but they'd have these almost blocks of time that I'm going to go do community now, quote unquote, and they would go and do this, or they would join something like the Lions Club or something in their town. It was very institutional. It was almost like you bought into something at an institutional level, and that's how community was done. And then you see other communities maybe forming around interests, which would be maybe another Graves level. They're forming around, maybe small business owners that are getting together, entrepreneurs, or maybe artists are getting together and they want to be really creative and proactive around their art. And then you evolve from there into another level where it's more sharing ideas and it almost looks tribal when you get up to some higher levels of that Graves model, that development. And you can see how almost like community goes through these different access points or development levels of how we access community. And I think that's important to think about because not all of us are going to be at the same level. So when you're creating a town like Arden, you have to take into account that a lot of people are at different developmental levels on like a Graves level vertical model. But if you're creating maybe a smaller knit community, maybe an online community or a temporary community like we created here in this room today, you can think in terms of being more specific of the type of person that you want to collect into that group. You can think in terms of the Graves level of person or a couple of those levels of the person you're bringing to that group. So I think as you talk about that just came to my mind. I think that's really important to think about. We get people that write in and say, I'm the only intuitive in my town, or I'm the only person interested in personal growth. I'm the only person that cares about a better world. Everybody else is interested in whatever they're interested in. That's not my gig. So what do I do? How do I connect with other people? Or how do I find somebody to fall in love with and marry and have a family with? Like, there's nobody around me that thinks like I do. And I think that's a tough position to be in. And you've got to be more proactive, I think, when you're in that position than maybe someone who doesn't have the needs you have. Or the desires to connect with other people of like minds like you and how unique you're wired.
I keep harping on this word intentional because I think that's the point of the entire podcast is this concept of an intentional community. It can be a physical location like Arden or Celebration or a commune or all the other different styles of intentional communities. But I don't think it has to be necessarily like a cohesive, this is where we all live now. You can create an intentional community, like a sub-community within your community or an online community. But the key word is intentional, meaning that whenever anything is intentional, it means that you had the power to help make that happen. And if you're feeling isolated or alone, if you're feeling like nobody gets you, the worst thing you can do is just sit there and wait for somebody to deliver something to you on a platter. Like, to wait for cool people to show up, that can happen. It can also not happen. If you wait for things, you can just end up in this hamster wheel of loneliness. You can end up feeling like nobody's ever going to show up. And then that creates its own host of problems, which is, like now you feel not only isolated, but you feel like there might be something wrong with you. Like, the longer you go without the basic human need of a community, the more you're going to have self-doubt or maybe self-recrimination or whatever comes up with it. So being proactive, being intentional, being thoughtful, and then acting on that intention is incredibly important. And like we mentioned, we can do that much easier through a virtual platform. Like, we can do that digitally now. We can do it online. But I would caution against this idea of only having online communities. There is something to be said for the kinesthetic experience of the energy that physical bodies have on each other. Like, we've been wired to be in each other's physical proximity. Yeah. So if we are only creating online communities, we're losing something in the translation. We don't have that ability to like physically and viscerally connect with other people. Even if we're not touching them, we're still experiencing each other's energy fields. And there's something to be said for that. So it's in some situations, in some contexts, in some communities, it is difficult to find like-minded people, but it's incredibly important. And you absolutely have the power to create that, that community. Okay, so and I say this because I'm in a community of people that I would not say are particularly like-minded. It's kind of a bit of a culture clash for me. I'm from the West Coast. I'm on the East Coast. And in the area that we're living in, there's not a lot of people who share our ideologies, our interests, etc. And then we decided that we wanted to have people around us, and we put out an advertisement for babysitters that basically painted us as massive weirdos. We were like, we're like these quasi-hippies that have no real relationship to most of the people in the community. So if you're into that, come hang out with us, right? Like, come be our babysitter. And we got weirdos. I say that with one of our ex-babysitters in the audience right now, who is also a weirdo. But what's interesting is that, they tended to be a little younger, but it was like a call of the wild. We ended up with all these people who were very counterculture, who didn't know other counterculture people existed. And we put something out there that said, hey, we're weirdos. You want to come hang out with us? We'll pay you to watch our kid. And even past the point where they stopped being a babysitter, they were still friends. They were still we ended up creating a bit of like a small little cute community of people who were attracted to this message in a bottle of weirdness. And we could be doing so much more. And I know that about us. I know we could be putting out more into our community, creating a bigger community of like minds, because I know that there are people who probably feel very isolated where we live, who are similar to us and don't really feel like there's anybody out there for them. There's always going to be somebody like-minded. So what I think is so cool about that particular experience of being here in Arden is this idea that it is self-reinforcing. Like once you get the ball rolling, the community itself will take some of that burden or some of the, like basically when you create a community and you have to, and you're going to create this intentional community, there's going to be resource it requires from you. If it's online, I mean, we run an online Facebook group, Intuitive Awakening, and it requires the resource of time to make sure that like everything is copacetic, right? Like people get into, they might say something kind of dickish and like you have to go in and be like, hey, could you please be less of a dick? Or like, you know what I mean? Like it's like people, you have to have the resource and the energy to be able to put into creating this intentional community. But once my observation has been in our Facebook group, Intuitive Awakening, people like do it themselves. I barely have to go in to like make sure everybody's cool. The community itself has become so beautiful and so wonderful that like not very much of that drama happens. In fact, I would argue far less drama happens in that group than most of the Facebook groups that I've been on. And so the community itself starts to want to protect it. So when you are creating one of these intentional communities, and if it feels like a lot of upfront cost, which it probably will be, especially if you feel isolated, especially if you feel like you're the only person there. And so now you have to like send all these messages in a bottle out to the universe and go, hey, I'm a weirdo here. Please attract other weirdos. Or I'm this person that's into this thing. Hopefully other people are too. And the upfront cost is high. But once the community gets going, a lot of that burden gets lifted off your shoulders because the community itself wants to protect what you have built, what you have helped create. And oftentimes when you leave, the community keeps going. I remember a writing workshop that I helped create over on the West Coast that when I left that writing workshop, I mean, I was the person who started it, but when I left it, it kept going long after me. It survived because the community itself became something that people wanted to protect regardless of who started it. And the same thing with Arden. Like the founders are long dead and yet the principle lives on. So I think when you're creating this intentional community, again, to sort of wrap up the points is number one, it's got to be intentional, right? Don't just accept whatever community you're in as if this is your fate. You have the ability to create the kind of community that will ensure that you're like the kind of person you want to show up as is supported. Again, you are the median of the 5 people you spend the most time around, and that's going to extend to your community. So the intentional part is very important. Understand that you can create a community that you want. And if those are digital communities, remember that there is something to be said for that physical interaction that you have with other people. So do what you can to also create physical communities as well. And then recognize that the upfront cost, which might seem very high, will lessen over time as the community itself reinforces and protects itself.
So if you're listening and you might be a part of our Intuitive Awakening group on Facebook, you might be a podcast listener. Maybe you're not part of a Facebook group, but you're a podcast listener. I consider you part of our broader community. We actually have some people here in the studio audience today that drove a long way to be here. They actually traveled from Washington, D.C., New York, other places. We have people from Arden that are here. So we've got a great mix of people from distance and close by. And we brought some people together from an online experience, came to see us and be a part of this experience with other like minds in a physical proximity. And so it's exactly what you're talking about, Antonia, this idea that when you get together physically, there's just a whole new level of excitement that can happen, a whole new level of interaction. You get to see each other. You get to literally smell each other.
Yeah.
I mean, literally. It's like, we're animal creatures at heart. So we have things that you cannot duplicate online. You just cannot do that. Yeah. And what's exciting about this specific podcast, the reason why we chose this topic, the reason why we're here in Arden kicking off this live podcast is because we know it's a great community. Meighan invited us to come and be a part of this experience here. And we knew some people were going to come in from other areas. But we'd love to go and begin to take that online experience and make it more concrete, where we get to meet people, but not just us meet you, if you're listening, but you meet other people that maybe are in your own town. We were in Portland. We did a meetup. It wasn't a live podcast, just a meetup, just to hang out with people at McMinimans in Portland, right? And a bunch of people came from the same city and were like, what? You're into this too? Cool. Let's hang out. And they became friends, and now they're hanging out, and they're friends in the same town. They didn't know each other existed across town, and now they do. This is the kind of stuff we're talking about. As we begin to build community online, we're going to bring this to a physical presence as well.
Yeah. Well, and to talk about startup cost, the startup cost for us before we got to the point of creating these meetups was about 2 years of podcasting. So that was like a really high initial cost. But now people are forming communities around the podcast that we don't have to do anything with it. Like they're just creating meetup groups. And in fact, somebody in the audience reminded us of meetup.com where I think the first time we heard about somebody doing a meetup around our podcast was like a year ago in St. Louis. And we're like, really?
In Kansas City, I think.
Oh, was it Kansas City? Yeah, you're right. It was Kansas City. And I was like, really? People are doing meetups around our podcast? That was like really weird to me. And then I thought, no, that's awesome. That's exactly what we want. We want people greeting these communities. And what's so great about meetup.com and other services like it is that you can leverage the technology of the internet to create that physical experience. So you get the best of both worlds.
Yeah, you ever notice you text people you spend more time around physically? You don't text people you don't see all year. You usually text or message people that you see every day. It's because it augments that real experience. And I think there's really something to be said for that. We tend to communicate more with the people we spend time around. So if you're listening and you would like a live podcast in your town, hey, we're open to coming if it all works out. We'd love to maybe do this as a tour, as something we can go take on the road and meet people in real time and spend more time building these physical groupings of people. We really like that idea of reaching out and connecting with people one-to-one in real time. So let us know. Shoot us an email and all that stuff. In fact, while I'm talking about it, head over to personalityhacker.com if you're more interested in more information. You can read tons of information, tons of free resources we have there. We've got videos and audios and recordings, and this podcast obviously is available to you. So head over to personalityhacker.com and also become part of this community if you can on facebook.com/personalityhacker, or we're also on twitter.com/personalityhack. We'd love to have you a part of this growing body of people who think very similarly about personal growth and doing big, epic things in the world.
And if you like our podcast, you can subscribe to it on iTunes and various Android platforms. And if you're feeling particularly generous, if you could leave us a rating and review on iTunes, that would be super helpful for us. It really helps us cross-promote our podcast, puts us higher in the charts, and that really helps out to create a bigger community.
Yeah. I would just want to thank Meighan for organizing and helping us on the ground here, and all the people that are associated with the Buzzware Village Center where we're hosting this today. And again, the community of Arden for opening up their community for us to have this experience in. So we really appreciate it. And I want to thank our studio audience, which is here. You guys got to be a part of an experience of creating a live podcast, and we really appreciate that you're here.
Absolutely.
So we're going to go hang out with everybody afterward, and until then, we're going to sign off here. Thanks so much for you listening at home, being a part of the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
And we'll talk with you on the next Personality Hacker Podcast episode.